Okay, so that's a bit about the damage there. Now, next here, we're going to talk about the way some viruses can essentially go dormant into a cell. As I mentioned, not all viruses go immediately into the synthesis and assembly and release following the penetration and encoding. What ends up happening in some cases is they can incorporate into the DNA of the host cell or just remain latent in the cytoplasm. So in some cases, the DNA of the virus just sits there. In some cases, it actually integrates into the host cell. Let me pull up a figure of that real quick. Here's a figure, once again, of HIV. HIV does this. Shows the virus coming in, uncoding, releases in this case, it's actually an RNA virus. RNA is converted into DNA. And then so that's shown here in red. This is now in the DNA form. And what's happening here is that the DNA of the virus is now literally inserted directly into the host chromosome. So this big X-looking thing, that's representing the host DNA. And this is human DNA. And so someone infected has the virus come in, convert itself into DNA, and then that DNA, the viral DNA, is then injected, so to speak, or incorporated directly into the host genome. What's amazing about this is that the host cell can't actually tell the difference between its own DNA and the virus DNA. There's actually no physical differences between the molecules of viral DNA, human DNA, or any other DNA. All DNA molecules look the same. They don't have any sort of identification markers like cells do, and your immune system or your cells cannot tell the difference. So once DNA is inserted, it just becomes synonymous with the rest of the DNA, and it's a real problem because now the body can't necessarily identify its own DNA from foreign DNA. There are sometimes other ways to determine that a cell is infected, but as far as the DNA goes, that becomes now part of the rest of the cell's DNA. So this is what we call a provirus. When viral DNA is incorporated into that of its host cell, that is referred to as a provirus. This can lead to the DNA being copied. So when cells go through mitosis and meiosis and copy the DNA and make replicates of those cells, that the viral DNA is copied right along with the rest of the host cell DNA. Again, the host cell can't tell the difference. So it ends up passing along the viral information onto its daughter cells, and then those cells can make copies and pass it on further. So the virus now literally gets a free ride and is copied by the host cells into future generations of new cells. And this is what we refer to as a persistent infection. Now, the host cell can, in some cases, be recognized by the immune system. There are little ways that the immune system has adapted to flag itself that indicates that the cell is infected by a virus. So your body can, in some cases, get rid of those, but it's much more difficult because once the DNA is incorporated, you now have to basically just destroy the entire cell, which is what a lot of times happens anyway. But these viruses are particularly good at kind of hiding from the immune system, keeping their DNA suppressed within the cell, and allowing that to be replicated down further cell lines. So that's the idea of a persistent infection. Now, this is not common to many viruses. It's pretty unique to a certain type of virus. Many of these are called retroviruses. Examples include things like the herpes viruses, herpes simplex, which include herpes type 1 and 2, which cause cold sores and genital herpes, genital warts. This can also lead to the herpes zoster, sometimes called herpes varicella, which is the cause of chickenpox and shingles. And many people are aware of the connection, but if you're not, chickenpox can lead to a latent persistent infection that can later manifest as shingles. So shingles is basically your chickenpox virus re-emerging later in life in a virus that has been in your cells since you had chickenpox as a child. So a lot of people, depending on when you were born, may get a vaccine for chickenpox. In the new protocol for chickenpox is to vaccinate prior to the virus, prior to getting it, and just avoid exposure altogether. Previously, the ideology, I guess that you might call it protocol, was to basically just let your kid get the chickenpox. And that's how it was for me and all my friends when I was young. Somebody had chickenpox and they'd say, "Up, just let them get it and let them get it out of the way now, and go ahead and let their immune system build up tolerance to it. And the logic behind that was that if you get chickenpox as a kid, it's usually not a big deal. This is one of the few viruses that if you get it as an adult, like in your 20s or 30s, it's usually much more serious. It's one of the few examples where it's actually kind of reversed. Usually it's more damaging when you're young. In this case, it's actually more damaging when you're older. And I think it has to do with the rate of cell replication. Your cells replicate faster when you're younger. And in that particular case, that actually is beneficial to allow a replacement of some of the infected cells. Whereas when you're older, the replacement of cells is slower, and the virus does more damage. There's more to it than that, but that's kind of the general difference in this particular case. Again, not usually the case. But anyway, in this case, if you get chickenpox as a kid, they now know that later this can manifest as shingles. So shingles is basically the persistent infection that you got as chickenpox that in some cases comes back out later in life as an adult. So that's an example of a persistent infection, which is also sometimes referred to as a latent infection. Another example I showed is the HIV virus, and then even viruses like the cytomegalovirus, human cytomegalovirus is another one here, also a herpes virus. So these are all kind of in the same general class called retroviruses. Retroviruses are essentially RNA viruses that convert themselves into DNA and then insert themselves into the host DNA, the host chromosomes. So this is somewhat unique to these types of viruses. So that's kind of how some viruses go latent. One reason why you can get an infection early in life and have that infection manifest later in life as an adult. Now on this next slide, we're talking about another kind of consequence of this, which is how viruses can sometimes lead to cancer. In a nutshell, cancer results from alterations in your DNA. You have in your DNA specific information that codes for replication cycles of the normal cell, of the cell itself, I should say. So your cells have information that says when to replicate, how often to replicate, when to stop replicating, why you should replicate. Okay, so basically you have all this information that says when and how and for what reasons to replicate as a cell. Cancer basically is a mutation in that particular information that prevents the cell from going through the replication cycles normally. So normally a cell replicates and then stops replicating. With a cancer cell, it replicates but doesn't know when to stop replicating, and it just keeps replicating and keeps replicating and keeps replicating, and that is when you form a tumor. Here's a figure. Tumors can also be referred to as a neoplasm. Neoplasm is kind of the beginning stage of cancer when it's forming. And here you're seeing some of the cells growing, and rather than stopping, they just keep growing and keep growing and keep growing and become a larger and larger mass. Here's another figure showing the same thing. So normally these cells would grow until they became equally distributed, like in your tissue. They would stop growing once they start bumping into each other. They get these kind of feedback mechanisms that say, okay, there's too many of us, stop growing and we're good. In the cancer case, those feedback mechanisms are distorted, they're mutated, and they don't get the proper feedback, and they just keep replicating and keep replicating and keep replicating, and that's essentially what cancer is. And the difference between a benign cancer and a malignant cancer is whether the cancer cells get into the bloodstream. A benign cancer stays in put. It only grows in one little location. A malignant cancer actually gets into your bloodstream and even the lymphatic system and spreads throughout the body and creates more tumors everywhere it goes. Here's another figure showing how cancer can get into the bloodstream, and now it can basically travel all throughout the body, causing little tumors everywhere it goes. That's the difference between a benign and a malignant cancer. But both are basically a distortion in the DNA that leads to inappropriate cell replication. So when it comes to viruses can distort your DNA. As we just showed, some viruses can insert themselves into your DNA. Every once in a while, when that happens, they cause a mutation in the DNA, and that mutation can sometimes lead to cancer. So anything that causes distortions in the DNA has a chance of causing cancer. And there's a certain probability depending on how much damage something is causing. Like smoking is a high probability because it causes lots of damage to your DNA. Exposure to sunlight causes damage to your DNA. And the more exposure, the more damage. So every little thing that causes damage increases your probability of cancer. That's why many different chemicals cause cancer, but some are a low probability, some are high probability, depending on how much damage they do. Viruses, once again, cause damage and therefore have the potential to cause cancer, and that's essentially what's happening here. So in this particular figure I pulled out of the textbook, they're saying up to 20% of human cancers are caused by viruses. That number could be different as of now. The textbook is always a couple years behind. My guess is it's probably higher than that, but I don't know that. I'm just totally speculating there. But my guess is there's probably more of that happening than what has been previously stated, because they're finding more and more examples of viruses that have been previously unrecognized. So viruses that do this are said to be oncogenic. Onco is a term that references cancer. ONCO is a reference to cancer. So an oncologist, for example, is someone who studies cancer doctor. So oncogenic are viruses that can lead to cancer. The effect that they have is termed transformation. Transformation just refers to the overall changes that can take place in a cell that has become cancerous. These include increased growth rates, the hallmark of cancer, alterations in chromosomes, changes in the cell surface molecules, and even the ability to divide infinitely. Just to clarify that, one of the most fascinating things about cancer is that some cancer cells literally become immortal. Unlike normal cells that have a lifespan, they grow so many times and then they stop growing, which is partly what leads to aging. Cancer cells unlock some sort of immortality. Not all of them, but some of them can actually continue to divide indefinitely, and they never actually die out, which is kind of crazy because that's not normal. So you have an aberration that actually leads to immortality in some cancer cells. So they're studying that, trying to figure out why that is and how we might apply that to our normal cells, and that potentially could lead one day to a revolution in how to prevent aging, and they're actually making all sorts of progress on that. So the viruses that cause these are called oncoviruses. I think I misspoke there a little bit. Let me just say there's kind of two words that say the same thing. The effect is said to be oncogenic, or I should say really there's really two ways of describing it. They're calling them an oncogenic virus. In this case, we're calling them oncoviruses. It's kind of two ways of saying the same thing. So the term I want you to know, to clarify, is oncoviruses. That's the term that describes a virus capable of causing cancer, oncoviruses. Oncogenic is kind of a different context of the word. So if you recognize onco means cancer, then you'll be able to get that answer correct. Examples include a papillomavirus. Papillomavirus is similar to what causes HPV. The human papillomavirus causes damage and can lead to cancer. Herpes viruses and even the hepatitis viruses, like hepatitis B and C, all have this ability to cause damage to DNA in cells that can potentially lead to a cancer effect. And as it says down here, the existence of these has created more speculation about other viruses that may be causing cancer. So like I said, the last figure said 20%. It's probably higher than that, but no one knows for sure, and those numbers can change on a dime depending on the latest research. So, last part here of the animal viruses and the replication cycle. When it comes to treating viruses, the best form of defense against a virus is your immune system. Having a healthy, fully functioning immune system is your best bet to clearing a viral infection. Typically, people who succumb to viral infection are those who are older and typically have a weakened immune system, and sometimes very young children who have a nasty viral infection can also succumb if not getting proper treatment. So for the most part, it involves your immune system. We'll talk about how this works when we get to chapter 14. Chapter 14 and even chapter 15 look at some of the mechanisms by which cells actually clear virally infected cells, or I should say how your immune system clears virally infected cells, and how your body can repair itself in most cases in response to a viral infection. So more detail on that later. Now, one thing that you can do is you can take antiviral drugs. Antiviral drugs can be effective at slowing down a virus in stopping either parts of the replication cycle or just putting the brakes, so to speak, on the replication cycle. So for young children, for example, who may not have a fully formed immune system, these can be a nice way to slow the virus down and give the immune system a chance to catch up. This is also true for geriatric patients or just anybody really. Antivirals are good at slowing a virus down. Typically, they're not going to stop a virus altogether unless you catch them very early in the replication cycle. So if you catch a virus very, very early, then it's possible to stop it mostly by taking antiviral. But really, by the time you even think to take them, some of the viruses are replicating and continuing their cycle. So ultimately, it comes down to your immune system to fully clear the virus. Antivirals are good at slowing it down and preventing the virus from outpacing your immune system. If you remember, I said earlier, it's kind of a chess match between the virus and your immune system. And it's kind of a game of who wins, who's faster, essentially, and usually it's the immune system. But in some cases, the virus has a leg up, and the antivirals will kind of knock it down a couple notches and allow your immune system to overcome. This can be the difference in people with a low immune system. And for people who are healthy, this is sometimes just a way to not be sick as long or prevent the full effect of a viral infection from taking place. So if you take something like Tamiflu, for example, Tamiflu is one of the more common antiviral medications. If you take that early during the course of an infection, like when you first start getting sick, you think, oh, I'm starting to get sick. You take Tamiflu, if it's actually a viral infection, then you might not get nearly as sick. You might prevent the worst symptoms from happening, and you may only have a day of illness and then followed by a quicker recovery. So for people who would otherwise fight off the virus anyway, and probably wouldn't succumb to it, the antivirals can just make you so that you don't get sick as intensely or as long. But otherwise, it's really up to your immune system. The immune system is the mechanism by which you actually rid the body of the virus. The antivirals simply slow it down. And unless you just take antivirals at the first sign of infection, or first, I should say, the first sign of exposure, and just completely stop the virus from getting into your body altogether, then unless that happens, then your immune system is necessary to fight it off. I will say, somewhat anecdotally though, I have just one kind of experience with it. This is totally anecdotal, not medical advice, just my experience. I have a brother who was out in Colorado. I was literally on the way out to see him driving, 10-hour drive. He calls me halfway and says, hey, by the way, everybody here is sick. He's got a wife and 2 kids. Everybody's sick. And just so you know, basically you're driving out into a sick ward on FYI. So I think, oh, great. So I went ahead and stopped at Walgreens and picked up some Zyrtec. Hadn't ever tried it before. And we took it religiously. It says to take it every 4 hours while you think you're being exposed. So basically, if you think you're in an area where you might get sick from a virus, someone's sick around you, maybe you work in a hospital, everybody's hacking up a lung, take this every 4 hours, and what it does is it actually blocks the virus from attaching to your cells. It actually blocks the absorption stage, supposedly, and prevents the virus from getting inside your body. And I tell you, again, totally anecdotally, it worked like a charm. I was literally being coughed on. I might as well have been injecting the virus into my bloodstream and didn't get sick. And that's one of the first times I can think that I've been that heavily exposed without any actual infection. So totally anecdotal, but I would highly recommend that if you're ever in that situation. It was about $15 and it was worth every penny. I would have paid 3 times that at least because it prevented me from getting sick, and that was a lifesaver. So it's another way. It's kind of like an antiviral. In that case, you have to take it early and often, and it basically stops the virus from actually getting into your cells, allegedly. That's what they say. So it appears to work. Again, I don't have a lot of experience with it, but I would at least recommend it. Give it a try. I've heard that from other students when I mentioned that. I hear a lot of positive feedback from other people who've had a similar experience.